The message came on a Tuesday. It arrived on every human communication channel at the same time. Radio waves, quantum link terminals, deep space relay stations, even the old satellite networks that governments had not used in decades, all of them lit up at once. The signal was clean, powerful, and perfectly translated into every human language. Whoever sent it had been watching humanity long enough to know how they talked, how they thought, and how they argued among themselves. The message was short. It said that the Galactic Conclave, a governing body made up of 47 alien civilizations, had voted, unanimously, to declare humanity an Omega-class threat species. It said that humans were too aggressive, too unpredictable, and too fast in building weapons and technology. It said that the Conclave had decided the safest thing for the rest of the galaxy was to remove humanity entirely. Not push them back, not limit them, remove them. It gave humanity 30 days to surrender all military vessels, dismantle all weapons programs, and submit to full Conclave governance. If humans refused, a combined fleet would be sent to carry out the edict by force. At the bottom of the message, there was a list of signatures, 47 names, 47 civilizations. Some of them had been trading with humans for over a century. Ambassador Serafina Voss was on board the United Earthship Resolute when the message arrived. She was in the middle of a meeting with 2 Conclave diplomatic officers when her aide placed a data tablet on the table in front of her. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she set the tablet down very carefully, the way a person sets something down when they do not want their hands to shake. The 2 alien diplomats watched her. One of them, a tall gray-skinned being called Counselor Veth, folded his long fingers together and said, "We hope you understand that this was not a decision made lightly." Voss did not answer right away. 11 seconds passed. The 2 diplomats counted them later, when they wrote their reports. Then Voss looked up and said, "We've heard this kind of thing before. On our own planet. One group telling another group that they were too dangerous to exist." She paused. It never ended well for the side that started it. Counselor Veth smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind a teacher gives a student who has said something foolish but understandable. "Ambassador, your species has 400 warships. The Conclave fleet numbers over 60,000. I say this not to be cruel, but to be honest. Resistance would only cause unnecessary suffering." Voss stood up, straightened her jacket, and picked up her tablet. "Then I suppose," she said, "you have nothing to worry about." She walked out of the room. Back on Earth, the message had already spread everywhere. It was on every news screen, every personal device, every wall display in every city on every continent. People stood in streets and markets and offices and read it. Some cried. Some went very quiet. Some started shouting. But something strange happened within the first few hours. The shouting stopped. In most crises throughout human history, people had divided. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to negotiate. Some blamed their own leaders. Some blamed other countries. Humans were very good at arguing with each other, even when the danger was real. But this time was different. This threat had not come from another nation or another faction. It had come from outside, from something that saw all humans, every country, every language, every old enemy, as the same thing, as one single problem to be solved. And something very old inside humanity woke up. It was not anger. Not exactly. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was the feeling of a species that had spent 10,000 years surviving things that should have killed it, suddenly being reminded of what it was made of. Within 24 hours, the United Earth Council held an emergency session. Every nation sent its representatives. There were no delays, no procedural arguments, no walkouts. Leaders who had not spoken to each other in years sat in the same room and listened. Within 48 hours, they had a unified response. It was not a surrender. It was not a declaration of war either, not yet. It was a single, formal reply sent to the Conclave on the same channels they had used. It was written in plain language, translated into all 47 Conclave languages. It said, "Humanity declines." 3 words. No explanation. No negotiation. No begging. On the Conclave's central command station, Admiral Cale Draven read the response and laughed. He was an old soldier, experienced in campaigns across 9 star systems. He had overseen the pacification of 3 species that had refused to cooperate with Conclave governance. He was not a cruel being, but he was a practical one, and practically speaking, he had never lost. He passed the response to his staff and told them to begin pre-war planning. "They'll negotiate within a week," he said. Fear always wins. His intelligence officer, a quiet and careful being named Sorvek, did not say anything. But later that evening, Sorvek sat alone in his quarters and pulled up everything the Conclave had ever recorded about human history. He had read pieces of it before, but now he read all of it. He read about humans fighting wars that lasted decades without stopping. He read about species within humanity that had been pushed to the edge of extinction and had come back. He read about a planet that had been almost entirely stripped of resources and polluted beyond recognition, and how the humans had slowly, painfully fixed most of it. He read about every time in human history when an outside force had told them they were finished. They were never finished. Sorvek closed the file and sat in the dark for a long time. Then, he wrote a report and sent it to Admiral Draven. The report said, in careful and professional language, that the Conclave might be making a serious mistake. Draven read the first paragraph, set it aside, and went to bed. Back on Earth, in a government facility buried 300 meters below a mountain range, a general named Harlan Cho sat across from a team of scientists and engineers he had not spoken to officially in 11 years. The project they ran did not have an official name in any public record. He looked at the people around the table and said, "You've all seen the message." They nodded. "Good," he said. "Then you know what comes next. Everything we built, everything we tested, everything we kept quiet." He looked at each face in the room. It's time. Outside, on the surface, the world was holding its breath. But underground, in the places no alien spy probe had ever seen, the lights were already on, and the machines were already running. Humanity had 30 days. It did not plan to spend them waiting. 3 months passed, and humanity went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant surrender. Not the silence of a people preparing to bow their heads and accept whatever came next. It was a different kind of silence. The kind that falls over a forest just before a storm. The kind that made experienced soldiers stop walking and look around because something had changed and they could feel it, but not yet name it. The Conclave noticed it first through their listening posts. Human news broadcasts, which had been loud and constant and full of debate since the edict was sent, suddenly became calm and controlled. Political arguments disappeared from public channels. The usual noise of human social networks slowed down. Civilian space traffic dropped by 70%. Ships that were expected to arrive at various trade stations simply did not come. Ports that had been busy for decades went dark. The Conclave intelligence teams flagged this as unusual and sent their reports up the chain of command. Admiral Draven read the reports, set them aside, and told his staff to stay on schedule. He had seen scared civilizations go quiet before. It meant they were preparing to negotiate. Silence, in his experience, was the sound of a species calculating how much it had to give up. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. The spy drones the Conclave sent into human territory began to stop sending signals about 6 weeks after the edict. Not all at once, one at a time. They simply went silent. They didn't explode. There was no jamming signal that the Conclave's instruments could detect. The drones flew into human space and disappeared, as if they had flown into still water and been swallowed whole. The Conclave sent bigger drones, then crewed scout ships, then a small reconnaissance fleet of 12 vessels to the edge of the Sol system. None of them came back. Sorvek, the intelligence officer who had already written one ignored report, wrote another. This one was longer. It pointed out that human technology should not have been capable of silently disabling Conclave reconnaissance equipment without leaving any signal trace. It pointed out that humanity had been involved in trade negotiations with the Conclave for nearly 90 years, and that during those negotiations, they had been required to disclose all significant military and scientific developments. It pointed out that no species had ever fully complied with that requirement, and that humans, given what he had read about them, almost certainly had not. It pointed out that they might not know what humanity had actually built. Draven read the full report this time. He called Sorvek to his office and asked him one question. Are you telling me that a species with 400 warships, living in 11 star systems, is a serious threat to a fleet of 60,000? Sorvek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am telling you, Admiral, that we do not actually know what they have. Draven was quiet too, for a moment. Then he said that war planning would continue on schedule, and that Sorvek should try to get some rest. On the human colony world of New Carthage, which was one of humanity's 11 settled planets, something strange was happening. The planet had a population of about 400 million people. For the past 3 months, every one of them had been working. Not going through the motions of normal life, while also worrying about the edict, actually working. The kind of coordinated, driven, almost frightening work that humans were capable of when they stopped arguing and started building. Factories ran without pause. Underground facilities were dug at a speed that surprised even the engineers doing the digging, because everyone showed up, and nobody left early, and nobody asked why. Families moved into shelters. Children learned new things in schools that no longer taught history or art, only mathematics, engineering, biology, and medicine. A woman named Dr. Lena Marsh, who had spent 20 years developing propulsion systems in a government research facility, watched her team work through the night for the 40th consecutive day, and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt proud, not because they were preparing for war. She had never wanted a war. She felt proud because she could see, in the faces of the people around her, that they understood what was at stake, that they had made a choice, not a choice handed to them by a leader or a government, but a choice made in the quiet part of themselves where real decisions are made. They had decided that they would not go quietly, that whatever came next, they would meet it standing up and having done everything they could. It was, she thought, a very human thing. On the Conclave homeworld, a scout commander named Orev sat in a debriefing room and explained, for the third time, that the fleet of 300 ships sent to assess the Sol system had been stopped at the edge of the system by something she could not fully describe. She said the ships had not been destroyed. She said there had been no weapon fired that her instruments could identify. She said the ships simply could not move. Their engines worked. Their navigation systems worked. But they did not go anywhere. And then humans had appeared. Not a war fleet. Small, fast ships. No more than 40 of them. They had moved around the frozen conclave vessels with what Orev could only describe as casual confidence. Her communications had been cut. Her distress beacons had not transmitted. And then, one by one, her ships had been boarded. The humans who came aboard did not yell. They did not threaten. They were calm, efficient, and polite in a way that was more unsettling than anger would have been. They removed everyone's weapons, guided the crews to secured areas of their own ships, and then spent the next several days doing something to the engines and computers that Orev's engineers could not identify or stop. When the conclave crews were eventually released unharmed, their ships intact, but stripped of certain components, they flew back to report. Orev had been debriefing ever since. The Conclave Council listened to her report in full silence. One counselor asked whether the humans had said anything during the boarding. Orev nodded. She said that before the human team left her ship, their leader, a young woman with short dark hair and a calm expression, had handed her a data chip. On the chip was a single audio file. Orev had played it for her superiors at the start of every debriefing. It was still strange every time. It was a drum beat, slow, rhythmic, ancient. The kind of sound that had no translation in any conclave language, because the conclave had never needed a word for it. It was the sound of something patient, something waiting, something that had already decided how this was going to end. In the council chamber, no one spoke for a very long time. Outside, somewhere deep inside the cold dark of the Sol system, every light was off, and every engine was still, and humanity was ready. Deep beneath the surface of Titan, Saturn's largest moon, there was a facility that did not officially exist. It had no name in any public government record. The people who worked there did not talk about it at family dinners or mention it to old friends. It had been dug out of Titan's rock over a period of 40 years, quietly, in stages, funded through budget lines that read as infrastructure maintenance and deep space geological surveys. If anyone had looked closely at the numbers, they might have noticed something odd. Nobody had looked closely. The Conclave's trade auditors had certainly never looked. It was called Project Ironwall by the small number of people who knew it existed. And on the day humanity received the Conclave's edict, every single person who worked there had already been at their station for 6 hours. The facility was enormous. It stretched across 9 underground levels, each one the size of a small city. The top levels held laboratories clean, white, very quiet, where scientists worked on things that had no equivalent anywhere in the Conclave's vast database of known technologies. The middle levels held manufacturing floors where machines ran without rest, building components that were assembled further down. The lowest levels held the fleet. Not 400 warships. Not anymore. Commander Yara Chen walked the length of the lowest level the morning after the edict arrived and counted the ships herself, even though she already knew the number. She did it because she wanted to feel it, the weight of what had been built, the years of work that stretched behind every vessel she could see. There were 4,216 ships. They were not the biggest ships humanity knew how to build. They were not covered in heavy armor the way the Conclave's dreadnoughts were. They were fast and angular, and built to work together in ways that no other species in the galaxy had ever designed a fleet to work. Each one carried an independent artificial intelligence, not a slave computer that waited for orders, but a true tactical mind that could think, adapt, and decide on its own. The ships did not fight as a chain of command, with orders flowing from admiral to captain to crew. They fought the way a murmuration of birds moved, each one responding to the whole, each one part of a single living decision. The Conclave's fleet was built on hierarchy. 60,000 ships organized in perfect chains of authority. They were powerful and disciplined and nearly impossible to stop in a direct battle. But a direct battle was not what humanity was planning. Chen stopped in front of one of the ships and put her hand flat against the hull. The metal was cold. She thought about the people who had built it. Engineers who had given the best years of their careers to a project they could never talk about. Scientists who had worked problems that had no solutions in any published research because they were problems nobody else had ever tried to solve. Soldiers who had trained in underground facilities for a war they hoped would never come, and who had kept training anyway because hope was not a plan. She thought about all of that, and then she turned to face the several hundred officers standing in formation behind her. "They told the whole galaxy they were coming for us," she said. Her voice was not loud. She did not need it to be. So we had time to get ready. That was all she said. It was enough. The technology that Ironwall had produced was not magic. It was not impossible. It was the result of 200 years of very smart, very determined people working on problems that everyone else had decided were unsolvable. Some of the discoveries had come from studying alien technology during trade agreements. Some had come from theoretical work that human scientists had been doing for generations, work that the Conclave's academies had dismissed as too speculative to be worth funding. The most important device was something the Ironwall team called a void anchor. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not fire anything. It did not explode. What it did was lock a region of space into a fixed gravitational state, a state so stable and so precisely calculated that faster-than-light travel became impossible inside it. A ship trying to jump to FTL within a void anchor field would find its engines working perfectly and its destination going nowhere. It would simply stop. This was how the 300-ship Conclave reconnaissance fleet had been captured at the edge of the Sol system. They had crossed into an anchor field without knowing it existed, and they had frozen in place as cleanly as insects in amber. The human boarding teams had done the rest. The second piece of technology was the fleet coordination system. It ran on something that human engineers called recursive adaptive intelligence, a system where every ship's AI was connected to every other ship's AI in real time, sharing information and decision-making at speeds no biological commander could match. When one ship learned something, every ship knew it. When one ship found a weakness, The entire fleet adjusted. The conclave's hierarchical command structure had a ceiling, the speed of communication between officers. The human fleet had no such ceiling. The third element was the soldiers themselves. They were not genetically engineered in the science fiction sense of that phrase. There were no growth tanks, no designed mutations, no artificial modifications that stripped away their humanity. They were simply the product of 2 centuries of careful, patient research into human performance, into what the human body and mind were already capable of doing, and how to bring people closer to those limits in a consistent and sustainable way. Better training methods, better nutrition, better sleep science, better psychological preparation. The result was soldiers who could function clearly and make good decisions under levels of stress and exhaustion that would shut down almost any other thinking being in the galaxy. Humanity had not made super soldiers. It had simply studied itself very carefully and taken its own nature seriously. On the Conclave side, the first major assault on humanity was launched against the Proxima Centauri colony, humanity's oldest off-world settlement, inhabited for over 200 years. Admiral Draven sent a fleet of 2,000 ships. He expected to find a colony world. He expected minimal resistance, a quick show of force, and a clear message sent to every other human world about the cost of defiance. The fleet arrived at Proxima Centauri to find an empty star system, not destroyed, not evacuated in panic, simply empty. Every human on the planet and in orbit had been moved in an organized, quiet withdrawal that had happened over the past 3 months, while the conclave was watching drone signals disappear and writing reports. The colony was intact. The buildings stood. The farms still had crops growing in the fields, and the space between the star and where the conclave fleet stopped was full of something that Draven's sensors did not identify until the first mine detonated. In 4 minutes and 19 seconds, the conclave lost 812 ships. The remaining fleet turned and ran. It was the first time in Draven's career that he had run from anything. He sat in his command chair while his surviving ships pulled back, and he thought about the report Sorvek had written, the one he had set aside, the one that said they did not know what humanity had actually built. He understood now. He opened a channel to Sorvek and said, very quietly, "Write another report." Sorvek was already writing. The war lasted 19 days. Later, when historians wrote about it, and they wrote about it endlessly, for centuries they argued about whether it could even be called a war in the traditional sense. Wars had front lines. Wars had battles where 2 sides faced each other with roughly equal intentions, each trying to break the other through force. What happened in those 19 days was something else. It was less like 2 armies fighting, and more like watching someone try to punch smoke. The conclave had 60,000 ships and centuries of experience in military campaigns. It had won wars before, against species that had fought back hard. It knew how battles worked. It knew how to take territory, hold supply lines, absorb losses, and keep pushing forward until the other side broke. None of that knowledge was useful. Humanity did not fight for territory. It did not try to hold star systems or defend specific planets. It did not line its ships up in formations and push forward. The human fleet moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted, splitting and rejoining in patterns that the conclave's tactical computers kept trying to predict and kept getting wrong. Every time Draven positioned a large force to meet a human attack, the attack did not come. Every time he left an area lightly defended because it seemed unimportant, something happened there that cost him ships or resources or, worse, information. Humanity was not trying to win battles. It was trying to break the conclave's will. The first major event happened on the 5th day. 3 conclave super dreadnoughts, the largest and most powerful ships in the entire fleet, each one, a mobile fortress, with enough firepower to crack open a moon, were lured into a dense nebula near a star called Kepler's Veil. The trap was simple in concept and extraordinarily difficult in execution. A small group of human ships appeared near the nebula, moving slowly enough to be chased, but fast enough that chasing them required the dreadnoughts to follow them in. Once inside, void anchors were activated. The dreadnoughts stopped. Their engines screamed and their pilots pulled every lever they had, but they did not move. Then, the human ships. which had been threading through the nebula using navigation systems designed specifically for dense particle environments, began their work. It took 11 minutes. All 3 dreadnoughts were destroyed without a single human casualty. When the recordings of the engagement were played back in the Conclave's tactical center, a long silence followed. Someone finally asked how the human ships had navigated the nebula so precisely. A technical analyst pulled up the data and said that the navigation algorithms the humans used were not in any Conclave database. They appeared to have been developed specifically for this kind of environment. Developed and clearly tested, long before the edict was ever sent. The realization that humans had been preparing for this for a very long time settled over the room like cold water. On the 8th day, something happened that became the most discussed event of the entire war. Hegemony Station was the Conclave's primary command hub in the region, a space station so heavily fortified that it had its own dedicated defense fleet of 300 ships and an automated defense grid that could track, engage over 10,000 separate targets simultaneously. Its shielding was thick enough to survive a direct strike from a capital ship's main battery. Its AI defense systems were considered among the best in the galaxy. It had never been seriously threatened in its 160 years of operation. 12 human Marines took it in 4 hours. They arrived in a decommissioned cargo freighter, an old, beat-up vessel that had been used to transport mining equipment, with no military markings and a registry that identified it as belonging to a private hauling company. The automated defense grid assessed it, found nothing threatening, and let it approach the station's freight dock. What happened next was the subject of intense study for years afterward. The Marines had done something that had no name in any Conclave military doctrine because no Conclave military planner had ever considered it necessary to plan for. They had simply looked at the station's design, which was publicly available in trade and construction records, and found 12 places where the automated systems had gaps, not because of bad engineering, but because the engineers had never imagined someone would try to attack a station with 12 people. Nobody attacked a fortress with 12 people. It was not rational. The humans did it anyway. When Conclave reinforcements arrived and breached the station doors, they found 12 Marines sitting calmly in the command center, having secured the entire facility, disabled the defense grid, and made themselves tea using supplies from the station's own kitchen. The commander of the Marine team, a man named Sergeant First Class Dio Adeyemi, looked up when the Conclave soldiers entered and said, in careful, accented Conclave common tongue, "We would like to discuss terms for your surrender of this facility." He said it without a trace of irony. On the 12th day, Commander Chen made a decision that changed the shape of the war entirely. Her team had, in the course of capturing Hegemony Station, gained access to the Conclave's own long-range communication network, the same system used to broadcast the original edict to all human worlds. She used it. She broadcast 2 things simultaneously to every Conclave world and every human world. The first was the original edict, every word of it, in every language, read aloud in full. The second was a live tactical display of the war's current status. Ship counts, battle records, the numbers at Proxima Centauri, the Kepler's Veil engagement, the status of Hegemony Station, all of it, laid out in clean, simple graphics that anyone could read, no matter what species they were or what they believed going into the war. The message did not include any words from humanity. Chen decided none were needed. The numbers spoke clearly enough. Within 24 hours, 9 Conclave civilizations sent private communications to human diplomatic channels, asking about the possibility of separate peace agreements. Within 48 hours, that number had risen to 31. Conclave fleets that had been moving toward human territory slowed and stopped. On several worlds, public protests broke out against the war citizens of the Conclave, who had been told the campaign would be easy and quick, and were now watching a live broadcast of exactly how wrong that had been. Admiral Draven, on the 16th day, sat in his command center and looked at the numbers. He had started the war with over 60,000 ships. He had lost nearly 40% of them. He had not taken a single human world. He had not destroyed a single major human military installation. He had not broken human supply lines, or disrupted their production, or done any of the things that a military campaign was supposed to do. What he had done was feed ships into a war that seemed to have no front and no edge, against an enemy that never fought the way he expected, in a conflict that was now actively falling apart politically, because 31 members of the conclave had decided the cost was too high. He contacted Ambassador Voss and requested a meeting. She agreed immediately. She arrived alone, with no escort and no visible weapon, and she sat down across from the Admiral in a small meeting room on a neutral station. She was calm. She looked, Draven thought, like someone who had gotten enough sleep and eaten a decent meal and had nowhere else she needed to be. He had not slept properly in 12 days. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the war began. "What are you?" he said. He did not mean it as an insult. He meant it genuinely. He had fought many species. He had never fought anything like this. Voss considered the question. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "The consequence," she said, "of your announcement." The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the dark between stars, the last of the conclave's forward fleets was turning around. The war had 6 days left. Neither of them knew that yet. But Draven looked at the woman sitting across from him, tired, yes, but completely unbroken, and thought that maybe Sorvek had been right from the very beginning. Maybe they had never understood what they were dealing with at all. The Peace Summit was held on Varith Prime, the homeworld of the Conclave's founding civilization, 19 days after the edict had been declared. It was the first time most of the alien delegates had ever seen a human in person. They had read files, watched recordings, reviewed intelligence summaries. But standing in the same room as one was different. The humans who walked into the summit hall were not what many of the delegates had imagined. They were not giants. They were not visibly armored or weaponized. They were just people, a small group of men and women in formal clothing, walking at a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, with expressions that were composed and open and entirely impossible to read. Ambassador Serafina Voss led the human delegation. She was not the tallest person in the room, not the most decorated, not the loudest. But when she entered, something shifted. Delegates from civilizations that had been in the conclave for 500 years found themselves sitting up straighter without knowing why. She took her seat and placed a single data chip on the table in front of her. The conclave's lead negotiator, a dignified elder statesman named Counselor Prath, opened the proceedings with a carefully prepared speech about the regrettable nature of conflict and the shared desire for lasting peace among all civilizations. It was a good speech. He had given versions of it 3 times before, after other wars. It was designed to set a tone of mutual responsibility, to spread the weight of what had happened across both sides, so that the table felt level. When he finished, he looked at Voss and asked humanity to present its terms. She slid the data chip to the center of the table. 4 things, she said. The room was very quiet. First, the conclave's military authority over non-member species ends permanently. No civilization that has not chosen conclave membership will ever again be subject to conclave military action, governance, or edict of any kind. Prath began to speak. She continued. Second, galactic trade is opened fully to all species, regardless of what tier classification the conclave has assigned them. The tier system is dissolved. All species trade as equals. A murmur moved around the table. The tier system had been in place for 300 years. It was the foundation of the conclave's economic structure. Dissolving it meant giving up enormous amounts of financial control over younger civilizations that had depended on conclave permission to access markets. Third, humanity receives a permanent, non-negotiable seat on any future galactic governing body. Not an advisory seat. Not a provisional seat. Permanent. Prath set down his notes. He looked at Voss carefully. Ambassador. These terms are. Fourth, she said. He stopped. A permanent galactic record is entered into every civilization's historical archive. The record states, in plain language, that the Galactic Conclave declared war on humanity and named us an Omega-class threat species, and that humanity declined to accept that designation. She paused. We want it written down. Everywhere. Forever. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Counselor Prath leaned back in his chair and looked at the human delegation. He had expected demands for territory. He had expected reparations, vast sums to compensate for the attack on human space. He had expected, given what the war had looked like, the possibility that humanity might demand the dissolution of the conclave itself, or the removal of specific civilizations from power. He had not expected this. None of the 4 demands asked for revenge. None of them took anything that was not already, in some sense, justified. They were designed to make sure what had happened could never happen again to any species. And they were designed to make sure nobody forgot. He asked for a recess. In the corridor outside the summit hall, the delegates from 31 civilizations who had already withdrawn from the war gathered in small groups and spoke quietly. Several of them had served on the council when the original edict was voted on. Several of them had signed it. Now they stood on the homeworld of the civilization that had proposed the whole campaign and thought about the 4 demands placed on the table inside. One delegate, from a marine civilization called the Seru, you found herself standing next to a human aide, a young man named Caleb, who had been assigned to carry documents and was currently looking out of a tall window at the Vareth Prime skyline. She studied him for a moment. He was young, maybe 25 by human years. He had no weapons. He was just standing there, looking at the city, with the kind of calm that seemed to come naturally to all the humans she had seen today. She asked him, in careful, common tongue, what his people wanted from this. Not the 4 demands she had heard those. She meant, underneath. What did humans actually want? He thought about it honestly, the way young people sometimes did when they had not yet learned to give political answers. To be left alone to do what we do, he said, and to make sure nobody decides to do this again. He glanced at her. To anyone. She did not say anything. But she remembered those words for the rest of her life. The recess lasted 3 hours. When the delegates returned to the table, Prath sat down across from Voss and signed all 4 terms, without further negotiation. The other delegates signed in turn. It took a long time. There were many signatures. The hall was quiet except for the sound of pens and the soft chime of electronic confirmation as each signature registered. Some delegates signed quickly and without expression. Others paused before writing their names, as if thinking carefully about what they were agreeing to. 1 or 2 looked at the human delegation while they signed, not with anger, but with something that was harder to name. When it was done, Counselor Prath stood, and Voss stood, and they looked at each other across the table. He said, "I hope this holds." She said, "So do we." That night, Voss stood alone at the viewport of the UES Resolute, which was docked in Vareth Prime's orbital station. The planet was below her enormous, glowing softly in the light of its star, cities visible as clusters of light across the dark side. It was a beautiful planet. She had never seen it before today. She hoped she never had to come back to it in the way she had come today. Her aide, a woman named Priya, came to stand beside her. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the planet too. Then she asked what Voss was thinking. Voss did not answer right away. She watched the slow rotation of the planet below, the way the light moved across its surface, and thought about the 30 days they had been given. The 11 seconds of silence before she answered Counselor Veth. The people in the underground facilities on a dozen worlds who had worked through the night for months. The 12 Marines, and a cargo freighter. A drumbeat played into empty space. She thought about all the times, throughout the long and exhausting history of her species, when someone had decided that humans were finished, that they had gone too far, built too much, survived too many things they were not supposed to survive. They were never finished. Priya asked again, gently, "Do you think the peace will hold?" Voss was quiet for another moment. Then she turned away from the viewport and straightened her jacket. "Ask them in another 1,000 years, she said. She picked up her tablet and walked down the corridor toward the light. "We'll still be here,"